What if a war that was about to explode suddenly paused? What if the same leader who said obliterate everything, just hours later started talking about peace? In just 36 hours, the narrative flipped completely, from threats of destruction to claims of productive conversations. But is this real diplomacy, or calculated strategy? And behind the scenes, was there a secret plan to end this war in days that has already failed? Tonight, we uncover what really happened. Good evening, and welcome to a special edition of the War and Peace Report. I'm Kame. Tonight's broadcast focuses on one of the most extraordinary geopolitical reversals of the modern era, a story that stretches from the halls of the Pentagon to the underground missile silos of Iran, from the oil choke point of the Strait of Hormuz to the intelligence war rooms of Tel Aviv and Washington. This is not just a story about bombs and missiles. It is a story about money, economics, politics, global supply chains, and the dangerous gap between military ambition and geopolitical reality. Let us begin. Firstly, discuss the sudden shift from obliteration to olive branch. What changed in 48 hours? Just 48 hours ago, the situation could not have appeared more volatile. The United States had issued a direct and unambiguous ultimatum to the Islamic Republic of Iran: reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or face immediate and devastating military strikes on Iranian power, plants and energy infrastructure. President Trump's language on Truth Social was characteristically blunt. He threatened to obliterate Iranian power plants, a word choice that shocked allies and adversaries alike. Military assets were reportedly repositioned. Strike packages were being reviewed at the Pentagon. Analysts across Washington privately said that war was no longer a question of if, but when. Then, without warning, everything changed. On Monday morning, Trump hosted again, this time announcing a 5-day pause on all military operations, and claiming that the United States and Iran had engaged in very good and productive conversations toward a complete and total resolution of hostilities in the Middle East. Within hours, the tone shifted from the brink of war to cautious diplomatic engagement. The world was stunned. How does a confrontation this heated de-escalate this fast? The answer, as we will show you tonight, involves at least 6 overlapping pressures, each one powerful enough on its own to give a leader pause, and together, powerful enough to change the calculus of war entirely. The first and perhaps most immediate factor is financial. Modern warfare is extraordinarily expensive, and this conflict was burning through resources at a staggering rate. Reports indicate that the Pentagon submitted a request for more than $200 billion in additional emergency funding to sustain operations. At the same time, the daily cost of the conflict was estimated at nearly $1.4 billion within just days of active escalation. Tens of billions of dollars had already been spent, and the ledger was growing by the hour. But this is not merely an accounting problem. It is a constitutional and political one. Every additional dollar of military spending requires congressional authorization. And on Capitol Hill, approval is far from guaranteed. A growing number of lawmakers from both parties have expressed alarm over the pace of spending and the lack of a clear strategic objective. A rejection of the Pentagon's supplemental funding request would not just be a fiscal setback. It would be a political humiliation, a public repudiation of the administration's war strategy by its own government. For a president who prizes the appearance of strength, such an outcome is deeply dangerous. No money, no war. In modern warfare, economic sustainability is just as critical as military capability. This financial pressure almost certainly forced a strategic reassessment at the highest levels of the administration and contributed significantly to the decision to pause. The second factor pulling decision-makers toward the exit ramp is inflation, and its devastating effect on ordinary American households. War drives energy prices upward. Energy prices affect everything: the cost of groceries, the price of heating a home, the rate at which businesses borrow money to operate. Almost immediately after the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted, global oil markets convulsed. Prices surged. The International Energy Agency made the unprecedented move of releasing 400 million barrels of crude oil from emergency reserves, the largest release in the agency's history, in a desperate attempt to stabilize markets. But no reserve release can fully offset the structural disruption of blocking one of the world's most critical shipping channels. The U.S. Federal Reserve has already adjusted its inflation forecasts upward, signaling growing concern about economic stability. Higher inflation means delayed interest rate cuts. Delayed rate cuts mean pressure on housing markets, rising borrowing costs for businesses, and instability in equity markets. For citizens, this translates into a higher cost of living, the kind of pain that voters feel acutely and remember at the ballot box. And with elections on the horizon, political strategists inside the White House are acutely aware that an administration presiding over surging inflation and costly foreign wars is an administration in trouble. The economic pressure to pause was not just a matter of policy. It was a matter of political survival. The third factor shaping this reversal is a stark absence of active military support from America's traditional allies. While several countries voiced support for coordination efforts around the Strait of Hormuz, issuing diplomatic statements and participating in multilateral calls, none committed to direct combat involvement. No allied fleets were dispatched. No joint strike packages were prepared. No foreign warships joined American carrier groups in the Persian Gulf. Even the most reliable members of the Western Alliance appeared hesitant to be drawn into a direct military confrontation with Iran. This matters enormously. A war fought without meaningful allied participation is not just more expensive. It is more dangerous, more diplomatically isolated, and far harder to justify to domestic and international audiences. The United States' ability to frame its military actions as part of a collective, rules-based response is severely undermined when its partners decline to participate. The absence of allied engagement changes the strategic equation in a fundamental way. It signals to adversaries that America is acting alone. It signals to domestic audiences that the war lacks legitimacy in the eyes of the world. And it signals to decision-makers inside the administration that escalation is a path they must walk without company, a reality that almost certainly contributed to the decision to slow things down. The fourth factor is one that receives far too little attention in mainstream coverage of Middle East conflicts: the vulnerability of global technology supply chains. Taiwan, the world's dominant producer of advanced semiconductors, relies heavily on imported energy to power its massive manufacturing ecosystem. Qatar plays a critical and often overlooked role in supplying helium, a gas essential for the cooling of semiconductor fabrication equipment and for the operation of MRI machines and scientific instruments worldwide. Companies like TSMC and NVIDIA, whose chips power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence systems, depend on the uninterrupted flow of these resources. If the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked for a sustained period, energy prices in Taiwan spike, production slows, and the global semiconductor supply chain faces rupture. That disruption does not stay in Asia. It ripples through every industry that depends on advanced chips, which is to say, virtually every industry in the modern economy. Automotive manufacturing, consumer electronics, defense systems, financial infrastructure, medical technology. All of it becomes vulnerable. When the prospect of military escalation carries with it the risk of a global technology supply chain collapse, even the most hawkish decision-makers are forced to reconsider. This is no longer a regional conflict. It is a threat to the foundations of the global economy. The fifth factor is the cumulative damage already inflicted by the conflict, damage that was rapidly becoming impossible to contain. Energy infrastructure across multiple countries have reportedly been disrupted. Oil supply dropped sharply, with analysts comparing the shock to some of the most significant energy crises in modern history. Fertilizer production, deeply dependent on natural gas, much of it transiting through the region, came under pressure, threatening agricultural supply chains and food prices globally. Helium supplies, as we noted, were disrupted. Shipping insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea skyrocketed, deterring commercial traffic and raising the cost of virtually everything transported by sea. At some point in any conflict, the cost of continuing exceeds the potential benefits of victory. Decision-makers, even those with strong ideological commitments to military action, are forced to weigh the damage being done to their own economies and societies against the strategic objectives being pursued. The evidence suggests that the United States, along with its regional partners, was rapidly approaching, or had already crossed, that threshold. The pause was not just diplomatically motivated. It was, at least in part, an acknowledgement that the economic cost of continued escalation was becoming unbearable. The sixth and perhaps most politically immediate factor is domestic public opinion, and its increasingly clear message to the administration. Polling data indicates that a majority of Americans disapprove of the current conflict. Fuel prices have surged, a metric that Americans track with extraordinary precision, given the visibility of gas prices on every street corner in the country. The connection between foreign military adventurism and the price of a tank of gas is not abstract to most American families. It is immediate, personal, and politically potent. With elections approaching, this dynamic becomes critical. Foreign policy decisions are ultimately judged domestically, and an administration that cannot convincingly articulate a path to victory, while presiding over rising inflation and the human cost of war, faces serious electoral consequences. It is worth noting that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, when pressed on Sunday to clarify whether the administration was winding down the war or escalating it, offered a remarkably candid formulation: sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate. Whether that is genuine strategic reasoning or post hoc rationalization, It reveals the administration's awareness that its messaging has become confused, and that confusion is politically costly. But while the world focused on this sudden pause, another story was quietly emerging from the shadows. A bombshell report revealed a secret plan that was supposed to end this war quickly, not through diplomacy, and not through conventional military victory, but through internal collapse, and it failed. According to a report by the New York Times, Israeli intelligence agency Mossad designed a sophisticated strategy premised not on conventional military victory, but on triggering an internal political collapse inside Iran. The plan's logic was elegant in theory. The idea was that intense military pressure, combined with a series of targeted strikes against Iranian military and political infrastructure, would create conditions ripe for a mass popular uprising. If the Iranian public, already living under the weight of decades of sanctions, economic mismanagement, and political repression, could be pushed past a breaking point, the government would face a crisis it could not manage. The expectation, according to the report, was straightforward: public anger would turn against the government. Protests would spread from major cities into provincial areas. The regime's authority would weaken, and the system would collapse from within, ending the war, not through military defeat, but through political disintegration. This was not merely a military plan. It was a psychological operation, one that sought to weaponize the Iranian people's own grievances against their government, and to use external military pressure as a catalyst for internal political revolution. But it didn't work. Despite the sophistication of the intelligence operation and the intensity of the military pressure applied, no mass rebellion materialized. The Iranian government did not collapse. The population did not turn decisively against its leadership, and the war continued on terms that increasingly disadvantaged those who had hoped for a quick, decisive resolution. The first reason the plan failed is perhaps the most well-documented phenomenon in political science: the rally around the flag effect. External threats, particularly those perceived as existential, tend to unite populations rather than divide them. Whatever grievances Iranians may have harbored toward their government, the experience of being bombed by foreign powers triggered a surge of national solidarity. The enemy outside the gates became more immediately threatening than the government inside them. The second factor was the counterproductive effect of targeting Iranian military and political leaders, rather than weakening morale and creating a leadership vacuum. Targeted strikes appeared to strengthen resistance and galvanize public support for the government's defensive posture. Martyrdom in the Iranian political and religious tradition carries enormous symbolic power, and the deaths of prominent figures in Israeli and American strikes may have reinforced rather than undermined the government's standing. The third factor is historical. Iran's population has endured decades of sanctions, economic isolation, and external pressure. This history has produced not passivity, but resilience, a deep, culturally embedded capacity to absorb hardship without political collapse. The assumption that additional military pressure would push a sanction-hardened population past its breaking point fundamentally underestimated the depth of that resilience. The fourth factor is an intelligence failure. The plan appears to have relied heavily on assessments drawn from the Iranian diaspora, exiled communities in Western capitals, who are, by definition, deeply opposed to the Iranian government and whose views do not necessarily reflect those of the population inside the country. This diaspora bias may have led planners to overestimate popular discontent and underestimate the regime's capacity to maintain control under pressure. So what does all of this add up to? What are we really witnessing in this moment of apparent pause? We are seeing a pause, but not necessarily peace. We are seeing a shift, but not a resolution. The pause could represent genuine diplomatic progress, the product of back-channel conversations that have produced real movement toward a political settlement. Or it could be a tactical recalibration, a moment to reassess, reposition, and prepare for the next phase of a conflict that none of the parties involved fully control. The 6 pressures we have outlined tonight: financial, economic, allied, supply chain, cumulative damage, and political, do not guarantee de-escalation. They create the conditions for it. Whether those conditions produce lasting peace or simply delay the next round of violence depends on decisions that will be made in the coming days, in rooms that the public cannot see, by leaders whose true motivations remain opaque. What is clear is this: the Mossad plan failed, the financial costs are mounting, the allies are absent, the public is restless, and the global economy is absorbing shocks that grow more serious. With every passing day, the next 5 days will be critical because this pause could lead to diplomacy, or it could become the calm before the next, more devastating escalation. What do you think? Is this the beginning of genuine de-escalation? Or simply a temporary pause before the next move? The answer may determine not just the fate of the Middle East, but the shape of the global order for decades to come. For democracy now, I'm Amy Goodman. We will continue bringing you the full picture. The voices you don't hear on mainstream media. The context that powerful institutions prefer you don't have. And the journalism that holds power accountable. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community, and stay with us because the story is far from over.